So welcome everybody and good morning, and I hope the course has been great so far. I hope my Welsh hasn't been too terrible, but I am only a learner. I'm chairing the session today, so it's really great to see you all here. And as we go along, I'm going to introduce our other sort of great speakers and guests. But first, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself and my own leadership journey. And in the process, I'm going to tell you something about sport, something about disability, something about diversity, something about change, and something about recovery. So all of that sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but I'll start at the beginning because, as they say, it's a very good place to start. So I was born with a condition called spina bifida. It often affects people's ability to walk and it's a lifelong disability. But I was a really lucky child in that I had a set of parents who really encouraged me to do everything. And my mother always used to say that nothing was impossible. And as a very small and rather stroppy child, I used to say, well, if nothing's impossible, then why can't you walk through that wall? But all the same, it did give me this kind of idea that you could grow up in an environment where I was encouraged to try everything and overcome barriers. And I think because I faced barriers very early on in my life, it gave me a really strong set of values that I wanted the world to be a better place, and I wanted the world to be really fair. And so I kind of grew up with that idea. Against all the odds, I actually learned to walk. I learned to swim actually before I learned to walk. I was quite late learning to walk. And it's quite a funny story from when I was a child about why my mother thought I should get to learn to swim, because apparently I was just fascinated by water as a small child when I could just crawl. One day we went to the beach and they decided to take my brother into the water. And so they tied me, a pair of reins, they tied me to the pushchair. They tied the dog to the pushchair and told the dog to not go anywhere, and took my brother into the water. And the next minute they found me and then the dog and then the pushchair all in the water. So my mother thought it'd be a good idea to get me to learn to swim. And I had grand ideas, as a 7-year-old, that I was going to be an Olympic swimmer and I was going to swim the Channel and I was going to do all sorts of things with my life, which I didn't actually end up doing. So I did all the normal things. I went to school and grew up, went to college, got a job, married, all sorts of things. But actually, my spina bifida caused a curvature in my spine, and I ended up finishing work through medical retirement quite young, and I took up archery because it was just one of the few things I could do. And it's an extremely long and kind of complicated story about how my archery career progressed. But basically, I just started. I liked archery because it's one of those things, that you can go out and you can score 20 points today and 30 points tomorrow and 50 points the day after. So you can really see your progress and really see how you can grow within the sport. And I entered a few local competitions. And then one day I was looking at the scores that were in the national magazine that said, how do you get to be on the team? And I looked at the scores I could get and I looked at the scores there and I thought, do you know what? If I decide to learn something, if I decide to get a coach, and if I decide to work hard, then maybe I can make those scores. And I managed to get onto the British team. So I had 15 years on the British team, which is quite a long time to be at that kind of level. And I had a really successful career. I'm one of the only disabled archers around who's actually shot for an able-bodied team. So I shot for Wales for more than 20 times. I love shooting for Wales. There's something special about pulling on a red shirt, I have to say. But there we are. I went to 6 World Championships and I managed to get a medal at each of them. And I did 24 internationals with 24 medals. So that's kind of feels like a claim to fame. But I sometimes now, when I reflect back on it, think that some of my other achievements that have come out of archery that have led me really directly to the journey that I'm on now have been more important to me in some ways than winning the medals. So halfway through my archery career, I had to have a big operation on my back. And I went into the operation walking with a really big limp and walking stick. And I came out of the operation with a Dyma frame and not able to get very far. And I ended up using a wheelchair for most of what I do in my life. I ended up actually shooting from my wheelchair, and now I use a wheelchair on a daily basis. And I think that's, I mean, it's brought big changes in my life, of course, you know, and we all have to cope with change in life. We all have different things that happen. But it's interesting that when we think about major change like that, it's our attitude to change that's really important. And I think it was very early when, after my operation, I realized that change isn't necessarily all good or all bad. Change is different. It means your life will be different in the future. It doesn't mean that life is terrible now and it was wonderful before, or vice versa. So the one thing I have found about using a wheelchair is that actually I can now do things that I couldn't do before. And it's true that in society there are an awful lot of barriers facing people who have disabilities, but there are really some positives as well. So the first thing I found out was that, having been somebody who just didn't used to walk very well at all, you know, I was now somebody who could zoom down the railway station faster than anybody because I had a set of wheels. So I can now go further and I can go faster than I ever could before. And that's a kind of interesting thing that I never really expected. And again, has given me the opportunity to do some different things that I couldn't do before. So, and one of those, of course, is that I'm now in a leadership space that, you know, before all of that surgery, I was in a lot of pain and I couldn't really do very much. So, you know, there's always a kind of flip side, a good outcome to some things. And we all cope with difference, don't we? And where we are right now in the world, where we're all wearing face masks in the supermarket, I think nobody could have imagined a few years ago that that would be us. And yet here we are. We've all got, you know, a box of disposable ones in the glove box in the car, 3 face masks in your handbag, 1 in your back pocket. And that's just become what we do in life. So those changes that would have been unthinkable, we've now just absorbed into society. And for some of us, I think those things will change. Will not change. We'll continue to wear those face masks, even if it isn't compulsory. And that's just the way that we've all reacted to this. And it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the things about a wheelchair specifically, talking, you know, as a wheelchair user, is that it's the symbol of disability. And yet, you know, the way I've just expressed it, the way I feel about it, is that for me, it's been the symbol of ability. It's been something that is enabling me to do things in my life I couldn't otherwise do. And as my very good coach said to me, who's the guy in the picture behind me in the black and white picture, he used to say to me, do you know what? A wheelchair is just a tool to do a job. It's like remote control for the television. You know, nobody gets up off the sofa and walks across the room to turn them. Well, you don't have switches on TVs any longer, but some of us are old enough to remember them, to change the channel. You know, you're going to use a tool to do that job, to make things easier. So there are lots and lots of assumptions that we make, and the assumptions that we make are often based on the things that we think people can't do rather than the things that we think people can do. And that's sometimes quite an important distinction. It doesn't stop there being barriers in life, as I said, but, you know, there is something about how we look at changes within the world. So my leadership journey started when I was an archer, and I was I decided that I would stand to be the athlete representative for the British team. And this was mostly because I was the only person, I think, chopsy enough to actually go into the performance director's room and say the athletes aren't happy about this or they're not happy about that. And over time, I'd got a bit of an international name. And so I got elected to be the athlete representative for World Archery. So I would go to the Para Archery Committee, and I was able to go into the meetings and see what was going on at this kind of, decision-making level. And one of the reasons I wanted to get involved is that we had a category in archery that was just for men. Now, I kind of thought, you can't have a category that's just for men. We're in the 2000s here. This is ridiculous. So I went into my very first committee meeting and I said, why is it that we don't have a women's category here and we have a male category? And I was told there aren't enough women. And I was thinking, well, I'm sure there are plenty of women out there. There's got to be just as many women as men. Now, actually, this category is for people with the highest level of impairment. So typically people who've broken their necks. And the statistics are that actually there are more men who break their necks than women, mostly because of things like motorbike accidents, industrial accidents, that kind of thing. But there's also women out there riding motorbikes and falling off horses just the same as men. So they kind of sent me away. And it was at that point that I realized that I had to make a choice as to whether or not I wanted to make a difference. So the 7-year-old in me who wanted the world to be a fairer place reared its little head and said, you've got to be at the table if you want to make a difference. And you have to be the kind of person that other people want to follow. So I went out there and I asked archers around the world if they knew any women who would be interested in this category, if it existed. And a really good friend of mine said to me, that if you want to change things, then it's much better to try and put out the fire from inside the tent. Her attitude is, and what the discussion we had was, it's no good just sitting on the sofa complaining that you want the world to change. You actually have to be at the table to make that change happen. So 12 months later, I went back to my next committee meeting, because they're international, so they're only held once a year. And I said, well, these are how many women we've got. And they all want to take part if there was a competition. And I was lucky then when I had the evidence behind me, that other committee members actually said, yes, she's absolutely right. And a very long story short, it was presented to the International Paralympic Committee, and that event was held in Rio Paralympics for the first time, which is something that I am really proud of. But it made me realize that this was the space where I could make a difference to people's lives. So it's how come I ended up in governance, I suppose. When I retired from sport, I ended up retiring because I had an injury, not through kind of planned retirement necessarily. I knew I was going to retire, but I hadn't quite planned to do it then. And transition is often really, really hard for athletes. And I was no exception. What tends to happen is people say to you, what do you do for a living? And you say, I'm a Paralympic archer. And then you wake up one day and they say, what do you do for a living? And you say, I don't know. I don't know who I am any longer. So you have to kind of reinvent yourself. So there's another sort of change that hurtled along in my life. And I sat back and I thought, well, what do I want to do? And I thought, well, I know all about sport. And there's an opportunity to get onto the board of Sport Wales. So I'll apply for that. So I did apply for the board of Sport Wales. And I was interviewed and I didn't get it. And I was thinking, well, goodness gracious, I know all sorts of things about sport. Why haven't they given me the position on the board? But I was incredibly lucky in that there was a chair at the time got in touch with me and she said to me, would you like to come in for a chat? So I went in thinking, yeah, I'll go in for a chat. I'll have some feedback, see how I did. I went in thinking, I know all about sport. Why didn't they give me a place on the board? And I came out realizing that you need more than just to be passionate about the boardroom in order to sit in that position. But she also helped me understand the things I had within myself that I just hadn't seen. So, for example, if you think about strategy, which is a very kind of, official sort of a word, if you want to win a gold medal, then you go, I want to win the gold medal in 4 years' time. So, because that's the next Olympics, Paralympics. So what do I need to do when I wake up tomorrow in order to make that happen? And that's strategic development. That's setting a plan for the future with a time scale of when you want to achieve it. And then just thinking about how you're going to get there. In my case, get myself a coach, get some more training, get better equipment. So that's strategic development. And she made me realize that risk and risk appetite is just about, well, if you go to a competition and your bow breaks, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to take a second bow? Are you going to take more arrows? So I suddenly realized I had all of these skills that I never thought I had before. But there were some gaps in my knowledge that she also pointed out. And I went out and I learned some more stuff around governance. I got myself a qualification. And the long story short is that the next time positions on the Sport Wales board became available, I applied. And I'm currently the vice chair. So I must have done something right along the way. So I was lucky, wasn't I? I was really lucky to get great support. And now I find myself in a position where I'm vice chair of Sport Wales and I'm vice chair of UK anti-doping. And at the moment, I'm the interim vice chair for an Iron Bevan Health Board. And I do all of those things because they all sit together with my core values, because I want the world to be fair and I want the world to be a better place for other people. So in all of those, they all connect with fairness, and fairness for patients. For example, in an Iron Bevan, I want patients to have the best treatment. I want kids to be able to play football. I want to be able to link those people in sport and physical activity and health together in Wales. And so that's why I do the things that I do. And I'd never sit in a boardroom, really, of a board that didn't sit within my core values, that I didn't really care about. So I just think, that often we're not there, are we, to pay the bills or maintain the building? We might think we are in our jobs, but the reality is that we only do our jobs for the people at the end of the chain. So in Sport Wales, for example, the decisions we make are not to employ staff, not to maintain the building. They're there so that kids can play sport. Everything else is, incidental along the way. But we need to make sure that we care about the people we employ as well, because they're all part of that system. And if we all care and we all care about the outcome, then the reality is that we'll produce something where we're a lot happier actually producing whatever it is we produce, but we get the best outcomes for people as well. And we do live in a time where people speak to the person with me instead of me because I use a wheelchair. I went to an office recently and I went in through the door with the CEO, and the man behind the desk who was supposed to give me a pass asked the woman who was with me what my name was. But the reality is there are those kinds of challenges still in life, but it doesn't stop me answering that question. And I know that the sum of my life, of my childhood, and those experiences that I've had along the way has led me to where I am now, and to give me the chance to speak to you today, because we're all coloured by our own experiences, and that gives us the lens in which we view the world. But sometimes it's just worth reflecting on the fact that all those things, even the things we look back on and think, oh, I wish that didn't happen to me, actually, that all makes us part of who we are. And I think reflecting on that more helps us to overcome any kind of challenge and change that we face in the future, because we realise that we've faced those kinds of things in the past, or maybe slightly different things, but we've overcome things in the past as well. So all of that kind of prepares us for a brighter future.